Imperial Yeast is at it again with their Imperialis project, creating yet another unique proprietary strain through hybridization. In addition to its excellent attenuation and rapid reduction of diacetyl, I-10 Mangostini contributes robust ripe tropical fruit, strawberry, and lychee notes that complement modern hops. And as a Kveik hybrid, it can be fermented anywhere from 78 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 to 32 degrees Celsius without any negative issues. Head over to imperialyeast.com to learn more about I-10 Mangostini and be sure to pick some up for your next batch of fruity IPA. Welcome to the Brew Lab. If you've ever been in a hop kiln while green hops are being dried, you'd swear you can smell wonderful hop aroma being blown off while the hops are drying. But as we learned last week, that aroma might not be as temperature dependent as we thought. I'm your host, Cade, and I'm back in the lab this week with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science to last week's episode by focusing on how to grow and process hops at home.
I think that home growing hops is kind of like the natural evolution of a home brewer. You know, you might start off with like a Mr. Beer kit, and then you start maybe even designing your own extract recipes. Before you know it, you're an all-grain brewer. But a lot of home brewers, at least in the Pacific Northwest where I live, naturally start to grow their own hops. It's just really fun to grasp one more part of the process and try to control it yourself and kind of dive into the agricultural side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly take a lot to grow your own barley, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it'd take a lot of space to do that. But hops grow vertically, which is great. And when you are in a climate like the Pacific Northwest, that's awesome. I mean, I think about like in Texas, there are a couple of places where they grow hops, but they grow them like hydroponically inside of greenhouses because you just can't do it. There's not enough rain in most areas, and it's just too hot through most of the year. But hops are a really unique crop. And this is something that we learned last week, that hops are almost fully processed at the farm, which is crazy. They're grown at the farm and then processed right there. Once they're harvested, they're sent to a kiln to dry before being baled. And it's that kilning step that got the attention in last week's episode with Dr. Lindsay Brewbottom, where I learned that hop drying temperatures may not play a big role in hop sensory or chemistry. And of course, that got me and you talking about what it takes to grow and process our own hops at home. So we decided to make that the focus of this Applying the Science episode. And Jordan, you've actually got experience growing your own hops, right?
Yeah, I've done it quite a bit, and I'm excited to kind of share some experiences and tips and tricks I've learned over the years.
Yeah, well, I have never grown hops before. I planted a couple of rhizomes this June, right? So just a few months ago. But that's my experience with growing hops. But I think this is going to be a fun episode, so I hope people will enjoy it. Thank you to all of our patrons who are out there listening. And if you're not yet a patron and you'd like to support us, you can get access to some awesome rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. The Brewlosopher himself, Marshall Schott, was this month's guest, and I think you just missed out on him at the time of this airing, but there's going to be another great guest next month. But hey, one thing I don't talk about often is that discount at YakimaValleyHops.com. Holy moly, that's a real discount, right? You should check it out. And Yakima Valley Hops now has Incognito, they got Spectrum, they've got a new one called Hop Kick. I mean, you might be able to get all of these things and other varieties all from YakimaValleyHops.com, and you get access to that by becoming a patron. All you have to do is go over to patreon.com/brewlosophy and check out the contribution levels. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time. Just check it out, patreon.com/brewlosophy. You can also support us by using the links at brewlosophy.com/support. Just start your shopping experience by using those links and we get a small kickback. Every little bit helps. It doesn't change your shopping experience at all. All you have to do is start by clicking the links at brewlosophy.com/support. Feedback is brought to you by the team at Haas, who are constantly innovating to provide solutions to your brewing problems. We've all had hazy IPAs, and since you're listening to this show, you know that getting a stable haze can be a challenge. Imagine you've brewed this awesome hazy IPA, you added your whirlpool and dry hops, it's looking great while fermenting, and then it drops crystal clear after you crash it. Well, the folks at Haas have you covered. Introducing Hop Haze. Hop Haze can be used in post-fermentation to add a stable hazy complexion to beer and other beverages. It's 100% hop-derived, flavorless, and beer and requires no additional mixing before use, and the haze stability is the same as the shelf life of your beer. So if you want to achieve that juicy look in your next hazy IPA, be sure to try Hop Haze, and also check out all of Haas's other innovative products at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Will wrote in with some feedback. He says, Cade, I had thought about the discussion you and Jordan had toward the end of the podcast about lager pitch rates and fermentation temps in regards to ester production. Jordan speculated that the reason he likes cold fermented lagers versus warm is the cold ferments do not produce esters. I might argue the opposite point, that warmer ferments do not produce as many fermentation byproducts due to the less stressful conditions of the warmer fermentation. The thing that Jordan may, quote, be missing in the taste of warm fermented lagers is the byproducts of a more stressful cold fermentation. I believe he stated that after a lagering period, he couldn't really tell a difference between the warm and cold lager ferments. I may have misinterpreted. It could be the cold fermented lagers need extended lagering times because the yeast still need to clean up the byproducts of fermentation, while the warmer fermented lagers complete this step faster because of the warmer, less stressful, and more favorable conditions for metabolism. Side note, when I refer to warmer lager ferments, I'm referring to 60 to 65 Fahrenheit. Personally, the lagers I've made warmer taste more clean and lager-like to me than the ones I've done cold, but taste is subjective. I just thought his argument was coming from a place bias that yeast only produce esters when fermented warmer and couldn't produce esters when fermented cold, even though cold fermentation are less favorable for metabolism, thus the reason for the increased pitch rate. Anyway, love what you guys are doing. Thanks for all the great thought-provoking content. Also, thanks to Jordan for being more of a traditionalist and bringing that point of view to the show. Cheers. What do you think, Jordan?
Well, the traditionalist in me has a couple comments here. So he says that the warmer ferments would not produce as many fermentation byproducts due to the less stressful conditions of the warmer ferment. So I think that the big thing there is sulfur, in that we do see greater levels of sulfur in colder fermentations. But I think that there is a pretty well documented suppression of ester production via the cold fermentation. So when it comes to the colder ferment, I think sulfur is the big thing to think about there, especially with sulfur producing strains like lager strains. But I think that this is why yeast pitch rate is so important, because indeed a colder fermentation would be a more stressful environment, thus the need or desire to increase your pitch rate to account for that. So we're kind of balancing things out in that regard. So that being said, he did actually misinterpret or misremember, because the test that we did wasn't actually cold versus a warm lager fermentation. That's something I want to test, and I hope to do that soon. What I did was I tested pitch rate in a cold format, where we had a cold fermented lager with a lager pitch rate and a cold fermented lager with an ale pitch rate. And although attenuation took much longer in the under pitched ale rate one fermented cold, they ultimately finished in similar numbers, a couple points off, and tasters couldn't tell a difference after extended lagering. So I think that there definitely is something to be said about yeast pitch rate and temperature and ester and sulfur production. And at the end of the day, it kind of depends on what you want and what you're going for.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and it's actually so fascinating that I do have an upcoming show with John Palmer where we talk about beer maturation and specifically this topic, right? This topic of like cold fermentation or warm and like the diacetyl rest, right? Increasing the temperature at the end of a traditional lager fermentation so that you can cover, take up diacetyl and acetaldehyde and any other, flavor components that you're not really, that the yeast will consume, right? The stuff like that, or, sulfur, allowing time for the sulfur to blow off or off gas. All of those things. So this is actually super cool, and I'm pretty excited to have that show with John. So look forward to that coming up. But yeah, not much I can add to this. I think both Will and Jordan are doing what I hoped people would do with this podcast, which is thinking about these cool things and then and trying to make better beer. So stay tuned and listen to that upcoming episode with John Palmer. I think it'll be a few weeks from this episode, but it's definitely going to cover this, Will. So hope you're listening to that one as well. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about how to grow and process hops at home. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
In the US, we're spoiled by having access to virtually any brewing ingredients that we want. Ingredients are usually either delivered to your brewery or within a short drive to the local homebrew store. So why spend the extra effort growing them at home? Well, why make beer at home? Am I right, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? We've gone this far. We might as well grow our own hops. And so I think that's kind of just expanding the fun of making your own beer at home is making some of the own agricultural products. And like you said at the top of the show, malt is kind of out of reach for the average backyard. You could collect your own yeast, and we've talked about that, but that can be tricky as well. And hops are pretty dang easy to grow if you live in the right region. And so, I mean, out here in Portland, they're just growing on everyone's backyards, whether they want them or not.
Right? The wicked and pernicious weed, as it's so often called. Yeah, it is funny, right? Because up here, that was one of the first things that my wife asked whenever we moved up here. She was like, "Are you going to start growing hops?" Whenever we moved up to Oregon, and I was like, "Yeah, actually, that'd be really cool." There are a couple of breweries in Texas that have tried to grow hops, at their facility, but I don't know. Unless you're growing one of those Neo Mexicana strains or something that's like grown wild in Arizona, I don't know that you're going to get much luck out of those, because growing hops is sort of temperature dependent. Now, that said, they're growing hops in Michigan. They're growing hops on the East Coast in North Carolina. They're growing hops in Texas. They're growing hops in New York. They're growing hops in the West, in the Pacific Northwest. Granted, 99% of the volume of hops is coming from, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. So, of course, if you live in one of those three states, then yeah, have at it. It's probably a little bit easier for you than other places, but hops are growing in other places. So I wanted to ask you this, Jordan, since you have more experience on it, how difficult is it to grow hops at home?
It's really easy. As we'll talk about today, there's a lot of things you can do. And like home brewing, you can definitely over-engineer the heck out of it. But it's one of those things, like I have some friends that they just let them go. They don't really pay attention to watering them, and they have a huge bounty of hops every year. But I do think maybe that's a good place to start is the regional acknowledging the differences based on region, right? So generally speaking, it seems that hops tend to grow in northern states. So Oregon and up, so the states that you mentioned, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Michigan, New York State, these are on the northern kind of Canadian border edge of the United States, and it seems that hops grow better up there. Now, we do know that hops need water, but Yakima Valley, where 80% or whatever of the U.S.'s hops are grown, that is a dry, high desert region. So they have intense irrigation. So there's a relationship, obviously, with water, and Portland is known to be rainy, but it doesn't really rain here in the summer when the hops are growing. And so you need to water your hops if you want to do it right, although I know people have had success just kind of letting it do its thing because they're that hardy. But generally speaking, you're going to have probably more success in kind of the northern half or northern quarter of the U.S., but it is technically possible to grow them virtually anywhere. And like you said earlier, the Neo Mexicanus varieties might be what I'd be looking at if I lived in a place like New Mexico or Texas or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it is right. I mean, this is where what people always talk about. Germany and the Willamette Valley, for example, which is in Oregon, are on the 45th parallel. There's actually like a sign that you drive past on I-5 that says like, you're now on the 45th parallel of the United States. And so it makes sense, right? That's where most of the hops are grown, like on this region, this 45th parallel region. And guess what? That 45th parallel is in the northern hemisphere and it's also in the southern hemisphere, right? So it it goes through Australia and New Zealand as well. And so that's why we get some great hops out there. Now, there's, of course, no other continents on that 45th parallel in the southern hemisphere, at least not that I'm aware of. Maybe like the southern tip of Africa, right? Maybe South Africa. You can get some hops growing from there. But yeah, if you're in that region, and that covers a pretty broad region, you know, I mean, the 45th parallel is pretty wide. I mean, you know, I'd say somewhere between like the 43rd parallel up to the 47th parallel, you can probably grow hops, I think, right? If I'm wrong about that, don't send me hate mail. I'm not exactly sure where the 43rd parallel goes down to, but somewhere in that, the 45th parallel being like the center, and then branch out a little ways from there. You can grow hops, and you can grow hops fairly easily. Like Jordan said, I mean, if you're in those areas, just plant it in the ground and it's probably going to grow. I mean, it's going to be, that's why I think people started growing our hops here in the Pacific Northwest. There's actually one of the farms that we often do work at with Oregon State is called the Alluvial Farm by Coleman Agriculture. And Coleman Agriculture, actually, that farm, that alluvial farm, sits in a town called Hopville. And it's literally called Hopville because 100 years ago, that's where hops were grown. People would come from Portland. They would take their carriages and their buggies and like move out to Hopville for like 2 months during the growing season. And it would just be this giant carnival party out there, which I think is kind of cool, right? So if you're in these areas, that's pretty cool that you can just grow hops from this area. But it does take a little bit more effort than maybe just planting it in the ground and letting it go, right? There are some things like trellises and all that sort of stuff. But first we have to talk about, how do you even get the hops, right, Jordan? How do you get hops to be able to plant? I got mine from a friend, but what did you do?
That's a good question. And I will say, notably, what else is grown on this 45th parallel? Malt. You know, malt in the U.S. and Canada is grown in similar regions that we see hops grown, as well as in Europe. So clearly there's some magic up here, and we do see the majority of the malt is grown in this similar region. But, you know, I don't want to discourage anyone south of us. Give it a try. And so maybe try to get your hands on some rhizomes from a New Mexicanus variety. So how do we get the rhizomes? So there's a couple different ways. One is kind of getting it from a buddy, or a neighbor or someone like that, or buying it from some sort of supplier. So Yakima Valley Hops sells rhizomes each year. There's other websites that sell rhizomes. I wouldn't be surprised if More Beer and Northern Brewer, et cetera, are also selling rhizomes on the internet. In the Pacific Northwest, homebrew stores have reliably sold rhizomes. I don't know what that looks like in Florida homebrew stores, so there might be some regional variation there. But an important thing about getting rhizomes is we do not have access to all the varieties in the world, and that is very unfortunate in my opinion. So in the U.S., we're limited to public varieties. So generally speaking, that's the C hops, Cascade, Centennial, Chinook.
Those are the C hops, right? But
in Columbus, that's right, in Columbus.
Okay, yeah.
And then some American noble hops, Liberty, Willamette, some like that. There's the new Vista hop is a public variety, so I'm excited, and I've really enjoyed my experience with that. I did a Hop Chronicles, check out that article. Tasters loved it, and that's a public variety, so I'm hoping that will be available in a rhizome format. There's some Neo Mexicanus ones that are available in rhizomes, and I've also seen some starts. So that's another option, especially if you live in the Pacific Northwest, the Portland Garden Store will have hop starts, so you can plant an already growing hop plant. And then, fun fact, Rocco hops from New Zealand are actually, were originally called Alpha Roma, and my friend grows those here. And so there are a few that have been ultimately renamed and were previously kind of disregarded as not that sexy. So like Comet, I think, is another good example of a hop that you can legally grow on your own. But things like Mosaic, Citra, Simcoe, these are trademarked hops. And unfortunately, even for home use, you can't do it legally. So there's nowhere to buy it, and there's no legal way to access it. So, and I don't know of any black markets for Mosaic hop rhizomes. So we're kind of limited to the varieties we can get our hands on.
Yeah, exactly, right? And you mentioned the C hops, right? And notably, one of them that's not included in the C hops is Citra, right? I mean, that's probably the number one grown hop in the United States. Or I don't know, Mosaic might have jumped it recently. But anyway, those two hops, Citra and Mosaic, are trademarked. Yeah, so somebody owns the rhizome of those hops. It's not somebody; it's the hop breeding company that owns those rhizomes. So if you see that HBC, which actually is kind of a funny note, right? We just saw that Pato is no longer it's Pato. It's now HBC 682, which likely means there was some legal trouble or something that went along there. But in any event, if you see that code HBC, that's Hop Breeding Company. So that is a partnership between Yakima Valley Hops, or I'm sorry, Yakima Chief Hops and John I. Haas, and they partner. They both fund that breeding company, and then they get access to the hop plants that are bred through that program. That program is important, right? That's how we get things like Citra and Mosaic. Strata is a new one that's here with Indie Hops, right? That's one that you might have also heard a lot about in the last couple of years. That's with Indie Hops in partnership with the USDA. I'm not exactly sure what the relationship is there or how long that's going to be a private variety, because I know Indie Hops funded most of that research, but I don't know exactly when those get released. But there are a lot of the most popular hops out there: Azaka, Eldorado, Simcoe, Citra, Mosaic. Those hops are licensed, right? And trademarked for better lack of a better word. So you can't grow those, and you can't grow those at home. If you have those and you're growing those at home, you can't tell anybody about it because the owner of those hops does have the legal authority to come and make you rip them out of your ground, right? Because you've technically stolen their property. But there are cool hops that you can grow at home, like Cascade, and one that you didn't mention, which is an older hop that I'm starting to like to grow a little bit more often, is Nugget. Which is one of those like old hops that I don't think about brewing with anymore, but it was in so many of those like 1990s, 1980s pale ale recipes that were like new and fresh and hip. I think it might see a little bit of a resurgence sometime here soon. But yeah, public varieties. So do you have like a set of those public varieties that you like to grow at home? Or is it just kind of like choose your favorite and go from there?
Well, I had a Chinook plant for many years. And when I moved to a home after it was initially planted, I took it with me. And so accessing the rhizomes from the store, you buy it, right? And it's typically best practice. In fact, they often, I think, bundle them, is you get like 3 rhizomes at a time because you don't know if all 3 of them will take off. I've had pretty good success, but that's why you typically want to plant more than one because a couple might not take off. So
first question though, what is a rhizome?
Right. And so that's one of the reasons that we can't really grow Mosaic at home easily because it's not really realistic to grow from the seed. And so first off, you don't typically see seeds and hop cones in commercial available products because they're trying to, I think that's like a hermaphroditic cone, and they don't want that. So you don't really see seeds and cones in the first place. So instead, the rhizome is like the root. And so if you have a buddy that grows hops, they can literally take a shovel and just dig into the ground and nick off like a 4-inch piece of root. That is a rhizome, and that's what you plant. And so when you get it from this homebrew store or a buddy, it's just like a dirty little stick. And you want to keep them, moist and alive in transit. You have a fairly, you wouldn't want to hold on to it for a year. So these are kind of like seasonal offerings. And when it's planting time, you basically throw the little stick in the ground. So let's talk a little bit about how you plant these little sticks that are called rhizomes. But Cade, you're the hop expert. Remind us, when is planting season?
Oh man, I am not the hop expert yet. But planting season, as I understand it commercially, is in this March, April timeframe. It's kind of like once things stop freezing, right? After freeze, and then like once it starts to rain and warm up in the ground. Now the hops will survive the winter, right? So you can leave them in the ground and they'll else survive. But planting is sort of that later, like let's say March or April typically. But I have heard of commercial hop growers planting new fields in June as well, because in June here in Oregon especially is kind of whenever it finally stops raining enough where you can actually get out into the field to do some planting, and you still have enough sunlight and that stuff where you can get a good stand on the hop. But yeah, what do you think? When do you plant them and how?
Yeah, that's about right. So roughly mid-April, and then you want to keep that rhizome. Hopefully the day you buy is the day you plant it, right? But if you have to hold on to it for a little bit, keep it moist. Don't let it dry out. Not too wet, So like misting it with your Star San bottle with some water or something like that. Keep it in the refrigerator. So, okay, it's planting day. So you want to find a place that's going to get as much sun exposure as possible. So, next to your house, next to your fence that's like shaded all the time, that's not going to work. The other thing to think about is you need space for it to grow. These things grow so much after the second or third year or so, and we'll talk about the first few years in a second. So you want space. You want sunlight, as much sunlight as you can possibly get for a given day. So I did see one warning, though, when doing a little bit of background research to make sure I didn't forget anything. You don't want a 24-hour light source because it will prevent flowering. So if you have some sort of like big floodlight that's on all night, don't have it pointing at your hops because you want the natural cycle of the sun. So you found your perfect spot. Generally speaking, it's kind of the center of your yard if you want to be as perfect as possible. Edges don't work as well because of shading, but people get away with it. It's just going to probably mitigate yield. And so honestly, you can probably just basically dig like a few inches, toss it in, and you're good. But if you want to kind of go deeper into it, they say dig a foot to loosen it up and then put that soil back in, and you put your rhizome down about an inch below where you're going to refill the dirt. And you want to have the little, I think they call them eyes of the rhizome. Basically, if you have a stick with other little mini sticks coming off, have those kind of pointed up so it will grow up. And you can look on the internet for various pH recommendations or soil nutrient recommendations. But in Portland, I just use the dirt, and that's what me and my friends have done, and we grew a ton of hops. So in my experience, all the extra add-ons haven't been necessary, but perhaps you could increase yield in your first year, or just it's the best practice, I'm sure, but it doesn't seem to need that much, and you want to water it. So you're watering this basically daily. You don't want to flood it. You don't have a hose turned on at 24/7, but give it a little bit of water each day because you don't want it to dry out. So that's really basically it. You can, again, plant 3 of each variety you want to plant. And if you're going to plant multiple varieties, you want to keep them a few feet apart because once these things get really hardy a few years in, they're going to grow so exponentially that if they're too close, you'll lose track of what's what. And if you're planting, 3 of them, maybe keep them, a few inches apart. But I think the rule of thumb is 5 feet apart for different varieties.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would say that there's 2 big things right there about growing location. One is you mentioned sunlight. The other thing is distance, because these hops are going to grow, like the vines are going to grow. If you don't have a trellis, we'll talk about trellising here in a minute, but if you don't have a trellis, if you just let the hops grow on the ground, it's going to grow everywhere. It's going to grow in all different directions, and it's going to grow together, and they're going to start overlapping and intertwining and all this stuff. I mean, it's going to make this just huge mess on the ground. But so that distance is important, right? Keeping them about 5 feet apart. I think commercial growers are something like 3 to 4 feet apart whenever they're out in the field. So if you're doing like row hops or something, you can keep them a little bit further apart. Now, this is an interesting note here too. I didn't know this until earlier this year. The USDA plant breeder, John Henning, told me this. It's that U.S. hops are bred to grow up, whereas English hops are bred to grow in rows. So they grow up. Like most U.S. hops will grow up a trellis like 17, 18 feet in the air, if you let them grow that high. English hops are meant to grow together, so they have like long sidearms, so you can actually plant English hops a little bit closer together than the American hops, right? Because the American hops, you don't really want them to grow together. You just want them to grow up. The English hops can actually, they support each other by growing sort of together in like a hedge, if you can imagine, like a hedge bush, which is kind of interesting. So if you're planting an English variety here in the United States, or wherever you are growing hops, that's something to keep in mind. You may not not want to spread it out that full 5 feet. You might want it closer at like 2 or 3 feet, so that they can actually like grow together and help each other sort of grow up. But that key thing, sunlight, and this was a key point too. That 45th parallel that we mentioned, that's because there happens to be a good amount of sunlight at that 45th parallel, or what they, because this is another thing I learned about hops this year. I'm learning a lot about hops, go figure, working for Dr. Shellhammer. But one of the things is that hops have this, their metabolism, they're a C3 plant, which means that they actually they need nighttime. So they are active and they're respiring and they're generating energy and photosynthesis during the day, but then they're sort of like recovering at night. So they need this like nighttime as well, but they need a lot of sunlight, right? They need a lot of opportunity to generate energy, but then they go to sleep whenever the sun goes down. So it's not like they're continuing to respire. There are some plants that continue to respire at night and continue to photosynthesize and all that sort of stuff. So this is pretty interesting that I'm just kind of learning through this, but sunlight and distance. All right. So that's kind of like where to plant and like getting the rhizomes and what a rhizome itself is. What's next? Where do you go from there? You got the rhizome in the ground, let's say in April or so. What happens next?
Yeah, and so from here on out, the instructions are going to kind of apply basically to your first year as well as your subsequent years, because once you have what is it called, a perennial plant, it comes back each year. Yeah. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so these instructions are going to kind of apply to both. So I'll just say this out the bat. The first year, you're going to get limited to no hops. Even if you have vines growing up, they're not going to produce much the first year. The second year, you might get a little. And really, it's like once you get into that third year, you start to really get a lot. And so there's a bit of yearly maintenance that occurs. And it's what I'm describing would be appropriate for the new grower as well as something that's coming back the next year. So if you have a 5-year plan or something like that that's just growing heaps and heaps of hops, once you harvest them, you cut those vines down, because one, it's an eyesore, but two, you're basically starting the process over, because they regrow each year, unlike a rose bush or whatever, which maintains its stalks during the dead season, if you will. So you're starting from basically nothing on the ground, and you're watering it, you're letting it get sun, and eventually things are going to start to creep up out of the ground. So the best practice is once they start to get a hold of them, starting to grow up, you're getting a few, you're supposed to keep the 3 hardiest shoots and then snip the rest down. So it devotes its energy to just 2 or 3 binds. Now, I've done that and I've not done that, and I've had success both ways. Maybe the quality of the hops are better. I don't know. But that's what they recommend, is to trim it down and just let it focus its energy on a couple per rhizome.
Interesting. So and that's another thing too. So it's going to grow different shoots. It's going to grow multiple shoots off of one rhizome. It's not like it's just growing one shoot straight up, right? It's not like a tree. It's not like it just comes out, there's one stalk and then it goes straight up, right? I mean, it's growing multiple binds together that are all sort of growing up. That's really interesting. Cool. Okay. So you should trim that down, to just focus on, 2 or 3 shoots per rhizome. So if you've got 3 rhizomes growing, that's 6 to 9 different shoots that are coming up from that single variety.
Yep. And so the way that this plant works is it needs something to grab onto for this to really produce a lot of hops. Is that true with Neo-Mexicanus? Maybe not. I'm not an expert, actually. Maybe those do a little bit better kind of growing on the ground. But for the classic Northwest varieties, like the sea hops that we mentioned, like if you're growing Cascade, you needed something to grab onto. So the easiest way, plant it near a fence or plant it near an arch thing in your backyard or whatever. And what do they call those?
I don't know. Yeah, like a trellis, but I mean a trellis is more like a wire or something for it to grow up. But I don't know, what do you call those arches? They're like those wedding arches. I know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so
the flowers grow up. Yeah,
that's the easiest way, is just plant it near that. And even if the sunlight's not perfect because it's near a fence or something, it's going to start grabbing on to whatever it's near. So if you plant it in the middle of your backyard with nothing around it, this isn't going to work out very well. So what a lot of home brewers will do is build a trellis system. And so that could become you could just put a 2x4 or something in the dirt, or it could be a system of wood that has wires kind of hanging down. And so the wire method is probably the most popular in terms of people that are actually building trellises. So you have a wood structure typically that has some sort of top on it. So like basically a homemade arch, and this like bine goes down to the ground, and you want that to be connected to the ground. So like somehow you're connecting it to the dirt so that it's a like taut piece of wire. And there's like, so you can get this kind of stuff at the gardening store.
Or just like cooking twine too, right? Like you can buy it at the grocery store, just like that you would like truss a chicken with. You can use that same like twine. Yeah.
You could use string. They sell hop bind twine, so twine, that kind of brown stuff is generally what we're using here. It needs to be able to support the weight though.
Yeah,
because
that's the thing.
These in the years 3+, it's going to generate so many hops if you're doing this right and you live in the right region. So it has to support the weight, because I have seen them fall. So you're gonna. I don't know if they on the hop farm production level how much they're manually manipulating this, but as the bines start to grow out and you have your trellis system built with this twine that it can attach to, you literally manually bend it towards it, and it's going to start naturally growing and winding around it up. And the commercial hop bines are 18 feet tall, and that's difficult to do at home. There is a house in Portland near my house that they did it, and you can see them when you walk by. They're like 18 feet tall. Most people don't do that, and I never grew them that tall. But they start to then like there's like nowhere for them to go, and so if you build a diagonal angle, they don't like that, and they're like trying to go up, and so you're constantly training it. If you go up and then it levels out and then it starts to go horizontal, you can manually train them to go horizontal, but they want to go up. So the higher you can go up, the more hops you can produce, and really what you're limiting there is yield.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense, right? And I see that, right? Like as if the hops that I grew this year, they went up to the top of the trellis. I just grew them on like a garden trellis that had like, like the little X backing wooden thing. And they just kind of like go right up that thing up a trellis that's actually like connected to a little like shade area. But they'll grow up. But I was actually talking with a grower earlier this year that's kind of when the hop plant like signals to itself that it's ready to start flowering and burring, is like, okay, I've reached the top of where I can go up easily or so, right? And it is about like 17 feet or so for American hops, which is really weird. He was telling me about this, and I was like, I don't understand how that science works, but he's like, that's absolutely why they hang them at this like 17, 18 feet up in the air, because that's as high as the plant will go, and then it'll start flowering and burring, and that means producing of the hops. So that height really, really is important. And it's kind of cool to see, like, the commercial growers actually do manually, they call it training, right? So they go out, I think it's in May or so, whenever there's enough of the bine that's grown up, and they actually, they have coconut twine that they manually tie to the top of these, 18-foot trellises that they've got out there. And then they drop that coconut twine all the way down to the bottom, and then they train it. They train each individual hop bine. They pick like the strongest ones, and they train them up. So they go up the coconut twine, and that's where they grow, which is really kind of cool to see. It's kind of an amazing, I don't know, it's kind of an amazing way that they grow hops. Like, it's such a unique crop. Like, you don't do that for corn stalks, right? I mean, the corn stalks, they just grow themselves, right? You might have to support them a little bit, but you don't need a trellis. Maybe green beans are the most one that's like most people would know is like most similar, because green beans do have a vine that has to like grow up a little bit, but we're not talking 18 feet. If you have an area in your yard that you can go 18 feet up and put a trellis that can support that height, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I don't want that to discourage people, because I was successfully growing hops 10 feet high or something like that, and I was getting a ton a few years in. You see people just fence height, and it's just like ton of hops are just collecting on their fence, 8 feet high or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, if you want to go all the way, 18 feet is how high you want to go. But really, the higher you can go, the more you can produce, and it's going to be okay either way. And that's what I love about this crop, is it's so easy, and it can be as hard or as easy as you want it to be. So train your bines. You'll notice they'll start to go off a little bit, and just veering off the other direction away from the rope that you're attaching it to. You just use your hand and bend it back over there and kind of like twist it around, and it finds its track again and keeps going up. So that's pretty much it. So some things you're going to want to watch. You're watering it basically daily. You can go away for the weekend. You don't have to hire someone to water your hops for the 3 days that you're gone. I did one time have hops die on the vine, and I assume it was like an underground pest, like a gopher or something, ate through the root system. But if there's like some scorching 120-degree heat wave, like probably a good idea to water on those days. But these are pretty hardy plants, and they don't tend to just like die on their own. But you do want to watch out for pests, and if you get a disease at the home growing level, it's probably just a lost cause. But you might notice some like aphids or something like that. I've never had hops that were destroyed by bugs. I don't know of any Portland homebrew friends that have had them lose entire plants to bugs. But I hear that ladybugs are your friends. So ladybugs are a good thing because they actually will eat those aphids. But it's a pretty easily plant up here, and it's not like at least the varieties I've grown, Chinook, and then I helped a friend with Cascade and helped a friend with Centennial. We haven't had too many problems.
Yeah. So you don't need like fertilizers or pesticides or anything like that. I mean, you can use them if you want and know how to use those, but it sounds like maybe not a huge deal. You're not having to add like extra fertilizers and stuff to your soil.
Yeah, I never have. And pesticide's kind of weird, right? Because unlike an apple, which you can wash, you can't really wash a hop. So I don't know. I don't really feel comfortable spraying poison chemicals on the hop cone personally.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least not without, thoroughly researching the pesticide and its use, right? Because that pesticide, like you said, especially at the homebrew level, is just going to go almost straight into your beer, right? So certainly want to watch out for those things. But that's cool to see that you can just sort of plant this in the ground, at least in the Pacific Northwest, plant these rhizomes, and then the hop is just going to grow, right? You may need some trellis, you need some rigging to get it to go up the way that it wants to go, but once you've got that situated, you're going to produce some hops. So the next thing that we need to talk then about is how do you snip those hops, how do you process them, and how do you use them in beer, which we'll do after this short break.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
One of the reasons I got into the hobby of homebrewing is that I thought it was cool that you could make your own beer. This idea of creating something unique that wasn't in stores was really intriguing, and while you can certainly buy hops at the store, there's something to be said about growing them for yourself, don't you think, Jordan?
I mean, for one, we don't know the alpha acid of these things, so it's unique in that regard, and that's one thing that we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. But, fresh hop beers are a really magical thing, and even living in the heart of hop country, I don't have unlimited access to them, And so with growing your own hops, you can make your own fresh hop beer, and that's really special.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I had never had a fresh hop beer until I moved up here to the Pacific Northwest. I mean, they don't exist in Texas, right? There are no fresh hop beers anywhere in Texas. I mean, maybe you could fly them in on like dry ice or something, but holy moly.
I think Pint House made one.
Oh, did they? Maybe I've just never had the opportunity to to test it. But I mean, wow. But that would take a serious effort, right? And it'd probably be just like a one release at one special brewery. But that'd be cool if you could brew your own grow your own hops and then brew a fresh hop beer. So that is obviously a nice use of hops that you grow from home. But we were talking about how you grow them up and what they look like as they're growing and what you need to do in terms of water and trellising and all that sort of stuff. But then the question comes, when are they ready?
And listening to this last episode, I always thought there was some sort of like chemical or physical test that they would do to like measure the moisture content or the lupulin concentration or something. And apparently they have hop whisperers that can like smell and touch the hops, know when they're ripe, if you will. So it's not as easy as one would think. And so generally speaking, what I would do when I don't have a hop plant currently, when I would just kind of like, you'd watch them, right? And you could like see the hops grow and they're like coming to fruition. And you'd start to hear like fresh hop beers are coming on the market and you're hearing that hops are being pulled down commercially. I would kind of just use that as my guide once I started hearing that commercial hops were coming down. And when the weekend worked for me, I would go for it. And you really got to be prepared if you're making fresh hop beer, because you got to either brew a beer that day or have a beer that's ready to be like wet hop, dry hopped with them, because you can't sit on these forever. So generally speaking, in the Pacific Northwest, that's about mid-August to mid-September. There are a couple things you can do to kind of like visually and inspect to make sure that you think they're ready. The aroma should be strong, right? So, and again, that's August, September is when that happens. You want to squeeze that mature hop cone between your fingers and make sure that you're finding that yellow powder, that's the lupulin powder, in there. So you can like rip it in half and you should see a ton of really bright yellow powder inside. So that's another indicator. They say it should feel dry and papery, and seal a hop cone earlier on in the season when they start to come out, and you'll feel how wet it is, and you'll see how it starts to dry out once they get mature. They also obviously get bigger, so that size is an indicator. And there might be a little bit of browning on the edges of like the bract. So basically like a hop cone, like the leaves that are kind of shooting off of it, you might get a little bit of browning there. That's another indicator that it's getting dried out. And doesn't mean it's ruined. Obviously, if the whole thing is brown or like, you blow it and it just like disintegrates, you've missed your window. But that, generally speaking, is like the list of things you're looking for to identify that the hops are mature and ready to be picked.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But first of all, I wanted to ask a question too. That maybe this is obvious, but you're not growing like Magnum or something like. You're not growing like high alpha varieties for their alpha potential when you're growing them at home, right? You're growing these for aroma.
I'm not, but there are Magnum. People do have Magnum in their yard, right? And so me personally, my opinion is that you should be using homegrown hops for aroma and flavor additions. Also, my recommendation is to use them all on Fresh Hop Brew Day, because as we'll talk about, drying has its challenges. But a big part of it, even if you could dry it perfectly at home, and some would argue maybe they can, the alpha acid's unknown. And maybe there's a science company out there that'd be willing to test it for you. Or maybe you're satisfied with just using an average. I have always kind of wondered if we get lower alpha acid content at the home grow scale. So maybe you just assume the lowest end of the range. I don't know, but it's homebrewing, right? It's all fun. So maybe that's okay for it to be a big unknown. But for that reason, it's like you just don't know what to put in your calculator, and it's just kind of a shot in the dark in terms of alpha acid.
Right, and if you're putting forth all this effort to grow the hops and everything, and then you're just kind of throwing them in the beer at the end, that seems kind of like, I don't know, what is it, like disingenuous? No, it's not disingenuous, but like, anyway, it just seems like you put in all this effort to grow this amazing hop, and you've grown the hop now, and now you want to use it, you want it to taste good. You don't want to just like guess and throw it in some beer. But I could see doing that, right? And if that's your jam, you go for it and do it. But for me, like you, Jordan, I'm probably growing aroma hops. Like I said, like I've got Nugget and Cascades in my yard right now. And who knows, I might expand outside of that in the future, but that's what I'm growing. So that was one comment that I wanted to say. Unless you have access to the alpha acids and you know what those are, it's probably best to use these as aroma varieties. The other thing you talked about was the actual like anatomy of the hop cone, right? Because that's important important for looking at maturity. So like if you look at a hop cone, the outer leaves, that's called the bracteal, bracts, that Jordan was talking about. And then when you rip open the cone in the middle, there's like a core piece of it, and that's called the strig. And the strig, right next to the strig, is where all that yellow lupulin powder is going to be. That's where the lupulin gland is, right up under next to the strig. So if you look at the bract on the outside of the cone, you won't see any yellow goodness. And we don't really want all that leafy material in beer. We have it because it's impossible to get the lupulin out without, using supercritical extraction or something like that. But you want that lupulin powder so you can crack it open. And when you first crack open a hop, whenever it's wet and green, that lupulin powder is actually like white or maybe even non-existent, right? It's not yellow, not this like bright golden yellow color. So that's one of the things that will change, like a physical characteristic. But then you talked about the hop whispers, and that was the other thing I wanted to unpack here too, is like a little bit of what commercial growers are do. And the commercial growers, to be fair, a lot of them do look at moisture, or they do look at some chemical analyses, some basic chemical analyses of the hops, but a lot of them are going out there looking at the papery aspect of it. They're taking those hop cones, they're crushing them in their hands, they're rubbing them between their hands, they're smelling, they're getting the lupulin all sort of masticated, and then they're sniffing them, right, getting them hot. They're that papery characteristic of the bract, that's super important for determining whenever something is mature. Now there are certain varieties, for example, that the growers will send off like a sample to an advanced lab, and they'll actually like profile the entire hop. So they'll take all of the component of the essential oils and map it. And once the profile matches their standard target, that's when they'll say, okay, go and harvest this. But the final thing I wanted to say was, I think one of the most important takeaways that you can take away here is like when to harvest them. Well, when other hops are ready, right? I mean, that's kind of like the basic way to do it. It's not like the hop goes ding. This isn't a plant where you can say like, okay, I saw the first burr on the plant. By the way, burrs are like early flowers. They look like little burrs. You'll see it whenever you grow your hops. But it's not like, okay, I saw the first burr. Now 60 days from that time point, I can harvest. No, I mean, it really is sort of unique. And you're kind of doing this on your own judgment. So whenever that cone starts to get kind of papery or a little bit brown around the edges, like Jordan was saying, when the aroma really comes to fruition, when you crush that thing and rub it on your hand and you go, oh my gosh, that smells great. That's whenever you know that it's mature. So so much to unpack there, but I did want to talk a little bit about that maturity. But then my question is, okay, I've picked a couple of cones. I think they're mature. How do I actually get it off the vine, and what kind of volume are we talking about here?
I mean, it can be a lot. And so your first year, you might not have any. You might have a couple hops, like enough to like take a photo of, and that's it. And we said burying them in the ground. We didn't say this earlier, but if you live in an apartment and you put them in a pot, it's not going to make that yield that much. And so you really need that root structure to be able to flourish truly underground. So there are some mitigating circumstances that dictate how much you're going to yield. But generally speaking, a single rhizome that's on its like third year or so, I mean, you could have maybe 2 5-gallon buckets filled to the brim of picked hops. So to get them down, basically you just cut the twine, right? You're snipping the plant. It's got to come out of the ground. It's done. You're killing it effectively, right? So you snip at the bottom, and you kind of disentangle it from the pole or whatever it is, and then you want to put that aside, hopefully not in the mud, because you're going to have to then go the tedious task of picking them off the bines. A tip that I learned is wear a long sleeve shirt, because hops are actually a skin irritant, and you'll be very itchy and rashy if they're rubbing all against your bare arms. You could even wear gloves, but definitely, in my opinion, wear a long sleeve shirt. And it's in the summer though, so it's going to be a hot day. Have beers ready and pizzas and your friends, because you will want the help. because even one plant that's a hardy plant, it takes a really long time to pick them. So
on that tip about like the long sleeve shirt, that's actually one of the things I think is because hops are, if you feel the vine, the way that it grows up the trellis is they're prickly, right? They don't feel, if you rub your finger over it, it kind of feels like rubbing your finger over a cat's tongue, right? It's like prickly and it's hard and it's not soft and smooth or anything like that. And they grab. And I think one of the things they do is create micro abrasions on your skin. So if you're in there, even the leaves themselves are prickly. Like the whole plant is just prickly. So if you've got it and you've got your hands in there, they can create little tiny cuts on your arms. And I know this whenever I'm harvesting, you go take a shower afterwards and like, oh my God, like this really hurts. So long sleeve shirt, totally.
Yep. So remember, we're not going to wash these things off like an apple. So in an attempt to you want to keep these things as, reasonably sterile as you possibly can. So what I would often do would have a giant, like 15-gallon kettle that I had previously brewed beer in. I'll pull the the binds down and put them in that as a storage container before we start like manually picking off each hop cone. So in my opinion, don't just throw them on the ground. Try, maybe have a tarp or something reasonably clean that you're putting them on, because after you pull them down, it's going to take a while to pick off each individual hop cone, which is how you have to do it.
Like finger by finger, each individual hop cone. I was talking about Hopville earlier, and then in one of the older books that talks about American hop growing in like, the early 1900s, late 1800s, that's literally what they would do. And all these people would go out there and they'd just be sitting around, chatting with each other and throwing this big party like you were talking about. Maybe not pizzas, but certainly some beer that they had around, and just picking these, like, picking it, throwing it in a bucket, pick it, throw it in a bucket, pick it, throw it in a bucket. When you've got enough buckets, take it over to the kiln and dump it in so it can dry over probably some live, a live fire, right? Or at least some sort of smoke that's blowing warm air over this kiln, which is kind of interesting to think about. But yeah, you're just picking it by fingers. And I think picking it by fingers is enough. You don't necessarily need like scissors or snips to do it. They pop off pretty easily.
Exactly. They pop up really easily. And so, point of clarification here, we're all brewers, I would imagine, and we know what a hop cone looks like. Yeah. And that's exactly what you're pulling. You don't want the leaves. You don't want the stems. And so, the big, like, fan leaves, whatever they're called, like some might mistake them for like a cannabis leaf. They're from the same family or whatever, right? And so the big, 5-pointed leaf, that's trash. The big hop binds, that's trash. The little bit of stem that might come off with the cone, that's trash. If you can, pull those off as well. So what I would have is just a bunch of friends and a bunch of like paper bags from the grocery store, and just one by one, you're tossing individual hop cones in those bags. So collect them in some sort of reasonably clean container. And if you have a lot of hop cones, you need a lot of containers. So that's why the paper bags are nice. And it can seriously take an afternoon if you have a lot of hops. And so one thing you might be doing simultaneously is brewing a beer, because you might be adding them to a beer that day.
Oh, that's a good idea. It's straight off the vine and into the beer. Wow, talk about fresh hop. I mean, that's as fresh as it gets. That's not fresh hops. Beers aren't even that fresh.
Well, professional ones are in the Northwest. They were picked 4 hours before or so. And so, but I think that's pretty straightforward. You pick them off and you put them in a bag. So we've done that. So let's talk about how to use them. So assuming you're not going to dry them, which we'll talk about next, you're going to put them in a fresh hop beer. And generally speaking, the rule of thumb is that you want to add these either at flame out or at dry hop. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One, we talked about there's an unknown alpha acid. Two, fresh hops, if you have never had a fresh hop beer, it has an interesting flavor. And there's a lot of chlorophyll or whatever. There's a lot of vegetal matter there and moisture that doesn't exist in a dried version that you would normally get from like the homebrew retailer or whatever. And so it doesn't work as well, in my opinion of others, earlier in the boil. So we don't add them at the beginning because we don't know the alpha acid. And the other thing is you might have so many that it might be adding too much bitterness to add them mid-boil anyway. So a common method is you add them at the end of the boil. And the rule of thumb I've heard is use all you got. Don't even worry about what they're worth, or their IBU contribution. Just add them all. And, knowing that you have a ton, maybe you want to reduce the temperature to 180 or 170. Maybe you want to lower off on your bitterness on the front end to account for the inevitable IBU pickup if you're doing this flame out method. I guess if you're making a IPA, your strategy for how much you add would be different if you're making a fresh hop lager. Like if you're growing Sterling or something in your backyard, maybe you wouldn't add as much. But when you add them to the flame out, one thing to know is that the rule of thumb is approximately, I think, 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 in terms of the weight that they represent now wet. If you were to dry them, it would weigh about 1/6 of that. So if you want to get at a big scale, you kind of do some rough math as to how much you're adding with like a guesstimate for alpha acid to kind of dial that in. But there are no rules on Fresh Hop Brew Day, so you kind of just go for it.
I know, and that whole thing, like, use all you've got. I mean, that's because you can't store these for very long, right? I mean, they're not gonna last out off of the vine. I mean, once it's off of the growing plant, it's just gonna start decomposing.
You have about 24 hours per that last podcast, and I've had received some for free that had exceeded 24 hours, and they start to smell like lambic cheesy aged hops. Ugh. They do not go well. They can mold, and I've even had a buddy who's a pro brewer who they got burned by a batch that had sat around too long, and it was not a good seller over the counter. You do not want to use wet hops that have aged too long. So before we talk about how to dry them and how, because you can avoid this, you can dry them. Another application is wet hopping or dry hopping with wet hops. And so that's even easier because you brew your beer a couple weeks ahead of time. And then on harvest day, it's so crazy. You're picking all these hops and it's so much work. Brewing a beer simultaneously kind of sucks. And so it makes your life a lot easier if you already have a fermented beer that you can just add them to. And at that point, you're basically dry hopping like normal, just knowing that you have that kind of 1 to 5 ratio in terms of their contribution. Some of the best fresh hop beers I've ever had have been from Breakside Brewing in Portland. And I know that this is kind of catching on, this method that they developed, but they use somehow they freeze these hops. Like, I don't know if they're using dry ice or liquid nitrogen. It's liquid nitrogen. That's what they do. And then they shatter them. And they're making incredible fresh hop beers that way. So I've never tried that at the home level. But if somehow you could freeze these things instantly and shatter them, it works really well. Another trick I've heard, and I've used this to success, is you make a standard beer, and with your dry hop, it's a blend of fresh hops and standard dry hops, because wet hops are kind of weird. And that's one thing that like Breakside, I think, does is blending it. It just gives it a little bit of more of a normal beer character with this fresh hop kick.
Yeah, you mentioned they're like a little bit weird, and I can certainly attest to that, right? There is sometimes like this like vegetal green character to wet hop beers, right? It's almost like maybe like fresh cut grass is a good way to say it, right? Like you're adding like fresh cut leafy material into your hops or into your beer, and sometimes that can be extracted, and so you kind of want to be careful of that. You don't want to just you don't want to fill up 2/3 of your fermenter with fresh hops, because you're probably going to get some vegetal matter extraction. But that 1 to 5 ratio seems like that's the key here, right? And so if you're normally going to add an ounce of regular hops, then you might want to add 5 times that, right? You might want to have 5 ounces of wet hops, and 5 ounces doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a lot whenever you're talking about these hops. So think about those things. If you're making an IPA and you're adding 3, 4, 5 ounces to your batch, then you're adding what does that go up to? Maybe 25 ounces or like a pound or more of hops. That's a lot whenever you're actually adding that volume to your fermenter.
Yeah, and technically speaking, it's the same volume from a whole cone equivalent, roughly, because it's simply the moisture content that's dried off via the drying process, but it hasn't been pelletized or it hasn't been baled. It hasn't been compressed. And so they're squishy, they're big. And, some of these things can be 3 inches long. And so they do take up a bit more volume despite the fact that it's just moisture that's contained within them. And so account for that, make sure you've got a good plan for filtering them out of the beer without introducing oxygen. But that's definitely probably one of the best ways to do this at home is just add them to a fermented beer as your dry hop, maybe blend in some standard dry hops to kind of even out that kind of odd note that it adds. And you have a homemade fresh hop beer. It's a really fun tradition to do each year.
And one other question then before we move on to drying, but you don't grind them or anything, right? You don't grind these up. You just throw the whole cone in the fermenter.
I've actually done both.
Okay.
And grinding is definitely one way to do it. If you're dry hopping, you don't need to do that on the hot side if you're doing it in Whirlpool. And if anything, it could, on some systems, it could have a filtration benefit. It's just a little easier to get the beer out, or arguably maybe you're extracting more of the goodness that way. So you can use a blender or a food processor to do that too.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay, well then if, let's say I don't want to brew a fresh hop beer, I want to store these hops and brew them later for use. Have you tried drying hops at home, and is it possible?
I certainly have. And so I recently heard what I'm about to describe is not the best way to do it. And I can't remember the reasons why, but at the commercial level, they're using a kiln or whatever you want to call it, a hot room that what we learn 125 to 150 depending on the method and the style and the era in which we're drying these. And so what historically homebrewers have done is basically leave them out to dry. And so what I used to do would put like a tarp over my spare bedroom's bed and lay them all out because I had a crap ton, and would have a fan blowing, like a box fan blowing in the room, and kind of turn them over. And after like 3 days, I'd package them up. The kind of common wisdom suggestion for like a easy DIY way is you put them on window screens that are like on ladders or something, so there's nothing underneath them, so there's a more even flow of air. But I heard recently, and I apologize, I don't know where I heard it and what exactly the reason was, but they argue that actually wasn't nearly as good of a method as like what the commercial pros are doing.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so I've heard of people using food dehydrators. You can accomplish this a lot more quicker that way. I've never done it, but I know there are people that do that. Given that they're putting these in the oven, it seems that if you didn't have that many or you're willing to deal with the batching of it, you could do it in your oven at a low, like 120 setting. But generally speaking, people are just laying them out maybe on a horizontal window screen and letting them dry out for like 3 days.
Yeah. I mean, I think the volume here is the problem, right? And in any kind of like food dehydrator that you're going to have at home, I mean, if you're talking about multiple 5-gallon buckets, right, from a single rhizome, that's going to be a crap load to fit into a food dehydrator. I know that they use these, a lot of the commercial growers use these food dehydrators whenever they're measuring moisture content. So they'll dehydrate like literally all of the moisture out, and that's how they'll figure out how much moisture is actually in the hop before it goes in the kiln. But yeah, kiln, these rooms in a commercial farm are like, there's giant burners. I mean, we're talking like, like a 4-foot, what looks like a jet engine burner that's blowing heat into a fan, right? And that fan is blowing that air that's heated up into a bed of hops that's on like a cloth or on like a giant kiln. And these kilns, remember, are 32 by 32 feet. So they're huge, right? There's huge volumes of air that are going through there and huge volumes of warm air that are going through it. But the benefit of this is that those hops dry really quickly. Right. So it's like in several hours, right? We're not talking about having them dry overnight or over 3 days, because the hops are going to start decomposing immediately as soon as they're off of the plant, right? So if you're not, if there's any moisture in that room and you're blowing, moist air through those hops, I mean, the hops aren't ever going to dry down to what a commercial grower would get it to dry down to. So there's mold issues. There could be, other things that are living on the hops, any of that stuff.
Yeah, and I think you could run the risk of like oxidizing your hops because it's taking so long. So maybe some cheesy flavors and aromas. And so I think that's why that article or audio or whatever that I heard about that was saying that's like not really that great to do it over 3 days in your bedroom. And so that's one of the challenges with this, right? So if you're going to do it via dehydrator, or just laying them out on your guest bedroom, you can actually measure the moisture content. Now, I don't have it in front of me, but the number is something like 10% or so moisture content. is approximately a good rule of thumb, right, Cade?
Yeah, that's the target. The target's 10%, but generally you see between 8 to 12, right? So in that range, yeah.
So you can just easily Google moisture content hops, and there's directions online. Maybe the University of Vermont or some university even had like a calculator that I found online when I was looking at this. But you can measure the moisture content, and that will let you know once those dried hops are ready to be stored.
Yeah,
so
I mean the method's super easy, right? I mean, you take some hops, measure out how much you measure. So like the standard ASBC method is like around 100 grams of hops. Take that, grind it all up, put it in some sort of a baking dish, right? Bake it at 100 degrees Celsius, 105 degrees Celsius for 1 hour, and then weigh it again. And that's it. And then that's how much, whatever baked off is the moisture that baked off, right? So that change in the weight, so you weigh the hops, weigh the weigh the pan, for example, right? Dump around 100 grams of hops in there, record that weight, bake it at 100 degrees Celsius, which is, I don't know, probably like, 212 Fahrenheit, something like that, 215, something like that. Bake it for 1 hour, and then weigh the pan and the hops, and then you do that subtraction, and whatever change in the percentage volume there is the amount of moisture that baked off. It's super, super easy to do if you want to measure the moisture of the hops, right? It's that simple, really. You just bake it, and however much bakes off is however is the moisture. So you want it around that like 8 to 12%, targeting 10% range if you're going to store it, and that's what the commercial growers are trying to hit.
Yeah, and I know that you can also do that in a microwave. I don't know the numbers on that, but you can Google this stuff. And ultimately, what you're going to learn is like, if I start with X weight, then 10% moisture content is Y weight. So you would then have a sample that you're eyeing in your like room that you're drying these in, and once you hit that weight, the net weight, via the change, you're at that point. But I never really did that. I just waited 3 days because it's kind of complicated at the home level. And so then you're going to have to store these. And, I know that like with Yakima Valley hops, a lot of the Brewlosophy contributors are not vacuum sealing their hops. I do not think that this is the product that you don't want to vacuum seal. You've put this much work into it. We've already kind of introduced too much oxygen, perhaps. I would really recommend vacuum sealing them. Also, there's a huge volume benefit. As you know, Cade, whole cone hops take up a lot more space, and the vacuum sealing compresses it down into a lot smaller package. And it's already kind of a risky proposition using homegrown dried hops. I think this is the one time to not skimp and actually vac seal them down.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that too, especially if you're ambient drying them over a long period of time, right? You've got a lot of exposure to oxygen there. I'm not sure how much of that oxygen exposure is actually going to change the hop aroma. I don't know. I just don't have experience on that. It seems like it would, right? That would certainly be my gut reaction is like, okay, I've got 3 days. I've been off the vine for 3 days. I'm not dried. I don't have a low moisture content. I might still be, even after 3 days, you might still be at like 20 or 30% moisture. Who knows, right? What you'd be at if you're not actually measuring that. But yeah, I would worry. I would want to keep it. I'd want to get it vacuum sealed as fast as I could. And I'd really want to dry those hops as fast as I could too, like batches in the oven or something. Maybe, part of it goes into fresh hops, and then you can do some small batches in your oven to get them nice and dry so that you can use them. But one of the key things too, don't go directly from your oven into the vacuum sealing bag, one, because it's going to be hot, right? But the other thing was, Lindsay was talking about the hops from the kiln go out into the baling floor where they sit and they homogenize. Now that's largely due to the different striations in a kiln, right? Where the bottom is getting really dry, the middle is kind of perfect at 10%, and then the top part is wet or wetter. You don't really have that issue as much as when you're a home brewer or home dryer. But if you are and you do have striations, you want to make sure they all sort of get homogenized to that nice level, right? You don't want some of them that are like super crisp and burnt, and then others of them that can grow mold or something like that. But get them vacuum sealed, get them in the freezer if you're going to store them. That would be my two things, is like get them away from any of those detriments. So, all right, Jordan, having grown your own hops and having spent all of this effort growing the hops, picking it, brewing a fresh hop beer, do you notice a flavor difference between homegrown hops and commercially purchased hops?
Well, that's an interesting question because it has been so long since I dried my own hops and used them in homebrewed beer. Once I realized that this was challenging to do, and also like questionable quality, I just switched to solely using them in fresh hop beers. And so if you are drying your own hops, I would actually play around with using them as a bittering addition and seeing if you can kind of like, it's getting a reasonable estimate of bitterness based on what you think it might be and based on what it tastes like. Maybe then start to dip into, assuming you're not getting too many cheesy flavors, dipping into using it as like a flavoring or aroma addition or a dry hop. But you could get burned. And so you want to, don't make a production level 40 barrel batch the first time you try these dried hops. So I think that generally speaking, you're going to struggle to have the same quality of a well-grown and sold, like packaged and sold commercial hop when you're drying them yourself. But when it comes to fresh hop beers, there's no limitation there. And you really can make commercial quality fresh hop beers at home. But I will say, given the challenge of these meeting the quality that we've come to expect from providers like YakimaValleyHops.com, you can go the complete opposite way. And this is what I've done, is take those leftover hops, put them in a paper bag, put them in your attic, forget about them for 10 years, and make lambic with them.
Right. Use old cheesy hops to make lambics. That's actually a fantastic idea. Well, I've always thought about that. Like, hey, if you've got old hops laying around, not all is lost. You've got great opportunity to make some sours there. That's a really, really good one. And if you just throw them in a paper bag and then use them to make lambics later. Well, it sounds like hops certainly take a lot of work, but it sounds like, Jordan, that the effort might be worth it.
I think it is. It's really fun. It's a fun annual tradition. Just like in the fall, we're making our Oktoberfest beers, and they are darn easy to grow if you live in the right place and you have the right yard space for it. It's just, dealing with them once they're grown. It's a little bit of work, but it's worth it, and it's really fun.
Yeah, and who knows? It might take a little bit more effort if you're growing them, say, in like Texas or Florida or something like that, but you might be able to do it. I mean, I know there are people that are growing hops in those areas, and I'm sure you can reach out to some people that might have had some success in whatever area that you're in. But yeah, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, plant some hops and make some fresh hop beers. Well, cool. I mean, we only had an hour to talk about this, so I feel like we went pretty fast through everything that we could do. But I think we got most of it, Jordan. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about growing hops at home?
Not really. Please send us your feedback if you have any comments or tricks or tips that we didn't cover, or alternative methods that you think are a better way to do it than what we talked about. There's a lot of exploration in that world, and I'm certainly just scratching the surface.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have way more experience than I do, but yeah, if you've got tips or feedback or any of that stuff, just shoot us an email and let us know. All right, well, thanks, Jordan, for talking about how to grow hops at home. Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.